Hello, and welcome to the channel. In this video, we'll be discussing the case of Kelly Ann Bates. Kelly was a young teenage girl with her whole life ahead of her. However, after meeting a man more than 3 times her age, this encounter would eventually prove to be fatal. A word of warning: if you're not already familiar with this case, please be aware that some of the details I'll be covering may be upsetting to some viewers. As you may have figured out, this particular case serves as a warning to the dangers of domestic violence. Regardless as to who is carrying out the harm, I think it's important to face issues like this head on, in the hope that it may inspire someone to find the strength to remove themselves from dangerous and potentially life-threatening situations. What I will tell you today should never happen to anyone. I've covered some shocking crimes in the short time since producing content on the channel, and I think this may be the one that sticks with me most. So without further ado, let's begin. Kelly Ann Bates was born in Hattersley, Greater Manchester, on the 18th of May 1978, to parents Margaret and Tommy Bates. Her parents were thrilled to have a baby girl, and they would nurture Kelly to be a kind, thoughtful child who would eventually become more independent as she grew to early adolescence and had aspirations of becoming a teacher. At 14 years old, Kelly had begun babysitting other parents' children to earn herself some extra money, and in 1993, while babysitting one evening, she was introduced to a man who, worried about letting Kelly walk home alone late at night, offered to walk her home. Despite the man being around 30 years Kelly's senior, this didn't bother him. He had no problem with grooming the young 14-year-old into a relationship, one which she would conceal from her parents, telling them that she had a boyfriend, but that he was from school and that his name was Dave Smith. Kelly's parents were pleased for her and wanted to meet the new love of her life, but they wouldn't have the opportunity to meet this individual for 2 years. During this 2-year window, Kelly would go from the fun-loving, happy, outgoing teenager she was to gradually withdrawing herself from her family, isolating herself from her friends, sneaking out of her home late at night, and sometimes not returning for several days at a time. Margaret would say that Dave would often call her home to check whether Kelly was there, seemingly concerned for her safety, when she would disappear for days on end. The image of Kelly's boyfriend being a nice teenage lad would be shattered when one day Margaret and Tommy would meet Dave Smith. When they arrived home, the couple were greeted by Kelly, who told her parents that her boyfriend was an older man, still lying about his age, with Kelly telling the pair that he was actually 32 years old. It was at this moment Dave entered the room. Margaret and Tommy would take an instant dislike to Dave. When later referring to the initial introduction, Margaret would say the following: "This wasn't the man I wanted for my daughter. I vividly recall seeing our bread knife in the kitchen and wanting to pick it up and stab him in the back." She also said that the sight of the man caused the hairs on the back of her neck to stand up. After Kelly left school, she was convinced by Dave to move in with him. But over the next few months, the pair would argue regularly, with Kelly leaving Dave and returning home to her parents, each time sporting bruises and bite marks. When her parents challenged her on her injuries, she would brush them off, attributing these injuries to accidents that she had. Tommy and Margaret would try to reason with Kelly and would repeatedly try to convince her to leave Dave. although he would use their desperation to further turn Kelly against her parents, telling her that they were being interfering and overbearing. Her parents would even contact the police on several occasions to try and intervene, but they were powerless to do anything, as Kelly was 16 at the time and was of legal age of consent in the UK to form mature relationships. It also didn't help that Kelly never reported Dave for domestic abuse of any kind. The tensions between Kelly, Dave and her parents would come to a head on the 30th of November 1995, when Kelly told her parents that she would be moving out of the family home and into Dave's residence at Furnival Road, Gorton. This time, for good. It would be the last time her parents would ever see their daughter. From this point, the only communication that they would receive from their daughter would be letters and cards, except they could tell that the handwriting on the cards was not Kelly's, but Dave's. The thing about Dave Smith is that this wasn't his real name. His real name was James Patterson Smith. Before I tell you about James, if you're aware of this case, you may have seen this image used when describing James. This appears to be a common error I came across while researching this case, as the man in this image is James Smith, but not the same man. This James Smith was born in 1936 and was the 6th to last person to be executed in a British prison after he murdered Sarah Isabella Cross in her sweet shop on the 4th of May 1962. His execution would take place on the 28th of November that same year, 16 years before Kelly was born. This is James Patterson Smith. James was born in 1948. Little is known about his past, except for the fact that he has an extensive history of violence towards the women in his life. By 1980, James had already been married and divorced, with his marriage ending due to violence on his part. Soon after his divorce, he met 20-year-old Tina Watson, where he was in a relationship with her until 1982. Sources state that he would use Tina as a punching bag throughout their relationship. She would say that at first, he would hit her every now and then, lightly tapping her. But as the violence escalated, so did the frequency. In the end, she would be beaten every day. He would punch her, slap her, and kick her legs, as well as in between them. He would also hit her over the head with an ashtray, and even try to drown her once while she was in the bath. James also abused Tina while she was pregnant with his child. She would eventually escape from the relationship after the drowning attempt, although it wouldn't take James long to find another poor soul. This time, he would target 15-year-old Wendy Mottershead, who he also abused relentlessly. She would also claim that Smith tried drowning her by holding her head down in a kitchen sink. By the time this relationship ended, and he encountered Kellyanne Bates, James was unemployed and living in Furnival Road, Gorton, in Manchester. As described earlier, by the time Kelly had moved in permanently with James, he had her completely under his control. Her brother would visit Furnival Road to make sure Kelly was okay, but James told him she was not at home. A concerned neighbour also demanded to see the young girl, but she was only allowed to see Kelly through an upstairs window. The last time her parents would ever speak to Kelly would be on the 10th of March 1996, where they spoke to her on the phone. Margaret had called to inform her daughter that she had missed a dentist appointment. During this call, Kelly promised to visit her mother the following Sunday for Mother's Day, but when that day came, she never arrived. 37 days after their last conversation, James Smith would leave his home, alone. On the 16th of April 1996, James Smith walked into the local police station near his Gorton home, where he would tell them that Kelly had accidentally drowned in the bath. He said that while Kelly was in the bath, they were having an argument. Kelly accidentally swallowed water, but James explained that she would often pretend to be unconscious, and so he left. But he did say that he had gone back to check on her 2 or 3 times. Upon realizing she had drowned, James claimed to try to resuscitate Kelly, to no avail. However, when police arrived at the home, it quickly became apparent that what happened to Kelly was not a case of accidental drowning. Her naked body was found in the bedroom of their home, and there was also blood found in every room of the home. Kelly's blood. She also had horrific injuries all over her body. Without hesitation, James would be immediately arrested for the murder of Kelly Ann Bates. Kelly's parents were notified of her daughter's passing, and it was Kelly's father, Tommy, who would identify her. A post-mortem examination was carried out on Kelly, and what I'm about to describe may be upsetting to some, so if you want to skip to this part of the video, please feel free to do so. William Lawler, who was the Home Office pathologist at the time, carried out the examination on Kelly. He would find the following: scalding to her buttocks and left leg, burns on her thigh caused by the application of a hot iron, a fractured arm, multiple stab wounds caused by knives, forks and scissors, stab wounds inside her mouth, crush injuries to both hands, mutilation of her ears, nose, eyebrows, mouth, lips, and genitalia. Wounds caused by a spade and pruning shears. Both eyes gouged out, which he determined took place 5 days to 3 weeks prior to her death. Stab wounds to the empty eye sockets. Partial scalping. Crush injuries to her knees, rendering her unable to walk. And she had also been beaten over the head with a shower head immediately prior to her drowning. He would go on to say that after examining almost 600 homicide victims, he had never come across injuries so extensive. And police also discovered that Kelly had been tied to radiators by her own hair. She had also been starved, losing around 20 kilograms in weight, as well as showing signs that she had not had anything to drink for several days prior to her death. Given the nature and the age of her wounds, it was determined the injuries on Kelly were not the result of a sudden eruption of violence, but rather a sustained period of torture, lasting up to 4 weeks. And yet, despite all the overwhelming evidence, James Patterson Smith still denied murdering Kelly. At the trial, the court would learn of Smith's almost 3-decade campaign of abuse he brought upon the women in his life. He would sensationally continue to deny murdering Kelly, and would outrageously attempt to portray himself as the victim, claiming that Kelly had put him through hell, and would constantly wind him up, as well as mock him over the death of his mother. He would also say that she had a bad habit of hurting herself, with the intention of making himself appear worse to others. When asked about why Kelly's eyes were gouged out, he claimed that she had dared him to do it, saying she challenged him to hurt her, to which he obliged. Unsurprisingly, the jury were buying none of this, and on the 19th of November 1997, just after 1 hour of deliberation, James Patterson Smith was found guilty for the murder of Kelly Ann Bates. Mr. Justice Sachs, the judge presiding over the case, said that this has been a terrible case, a catalogue of depravity by one human being upon another. You are a highly dangerous person. You are an abuser of women and I intend, so far as it is in my power, that you will abuse no more." He sentenced Smith to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. This was also the first time that an entire jury was offered counselling, due to the horrific nature of the crime. Understandably, all jury members accepted this offer. To this day, James Patterson Smith remains in prison. This was one of the few cases I've covered which has left me awake at night. James Patterson Smith was a monster, pure and simple. I hope that he never sees the light of day again. One thing that really irked me while researching the case, besides the incorrect image for Smith being used, were the claims that because Kelly was 16, she was an adult. This is simply not true. In the UK, an individual isn't considered legally an adult until they reach 18. Kelly was a child, although because of her age at the time, she was able to legally consent into entering a relationship, as well as move out of her home without the consent of her parents. But this relationship started when she was just 14 years old. Had her parents known the truth much sooner, maybe the circumstances would have been different. That being said, her parents did what they could from a legal point of view. Margaret sadly passed away on the 17th of December 2020 after a long battle with illness. She is survived by her husband Tommy, as well as their 2 sons. She was 65. For this video, I wanted to go back to a story which at the time was overshadowed by another high-profile crime. Suzanne Capper's story isn't only a tragic one, but one that demonstrates just how truly evil people can be. I've titled the video the way I have because Suzanne's story has similarities to that of Kellyanne Bates, a case I've covered here before. Like Kelly, Suzanne was subjected to a prolonged period of abuse which would last several days. However, in this case, 6 people would be found to be responsible for this abhorrent crime. A word of warning. This video won't be for the faint-hearted. Parts of this story may be disturbing to some viewers. And so if you're ready, let's begin. Suzanne Capper, born in Manchester 1976, was described by her stepfather John as a high-spirited, well-mannered girl who wanted nothing more in life than to be loved. However, she was also said to be easily influenced. Suzanne never knew her biological father, but she did live with her mother Elizabeth and her stepfather John. She also had a younger sister, Michelle. Her home life was less than ideal. It was said that her mother failed to show her the love and affection one would come to expect, and by 1990, Elizabeth's marriage to John would end in divorce. Desperate for love and affection, and with little to no friends, Suzanne would play truant from school and would often spend nights at the homes of other people. At the time, she and John were living in Morton, Manchester. One of the homes that Suzanne would often frequent was 97 Langworthy Road. In the home lived Jean Powell, 26, and her 3 children. Her friend, Bernadette McNeely, 24, and her 3 children lived at 91 Langworthy Road, but spent far more time at Jean's than at her own place. People would often be seen coming in and out of the house, most notably 39-year-old Glyn Powell, Jean's ex-husband, Clifford Pook, Jean's 18-year-old brother, and 2 other men that Jean was having sexual relations with, 16-year-old Anthony Dudson and 26-year-old Jeffrey Lee. Dudson was also sexually involved with Bernadette. Suzanne would be introduced to Jean in 1990 after she had begun babysitting for her children. Her stepfather was wary of Suzanne attending the home, explaining that he had a strange feeling about Jean and those who frequented what he called a house of evil. He later said, quote, "I tried to stop Suzanne going there, but she had a very strong will." Unfortunately for John, he wasn't fully aware of the goings-on within 97 Langworthy Road. Inside the run-down house, there would regularly be parties where drugs such as amphetamines would be openly distributed. Bernadette herself was a drug addict, whereas Glyn and Jeffrey were both convicted criminals, with the latter reportedly sinking as low as to steal from his own 86-year-old grandmother. Additionally, various criminal activities would occur at the home. In particular, drug dealing, and also stolen car parts were sprawled all throughout the home. Needless to say, these people weren't exactly what you'd consider to be model citizens. Suzanne, however, saw them differently. Her younger sister Michelle said that Suzanne would do anything for them, but in return, she would be bullied by all 6 of them relentlessly. Over time, she would stay there more often, leading a now worried John to plead for her to come back home, only for Suzanne to decline. However, this wasn't out of fear of Jean and her regular visitors. Instead, it was out of a warped sense of loyalty to them. Up until now, Suzanne never had companionship in her life. A father she never knew, a mother who seemingly cared little for her. Here, despite the abuse, she felt a sense of human contact. The thought of ending it and going back to what she knew was too difficult for her. Although in late 1992, the bullying escalated further and Jean would attack Suzanne, beating her badly. Suzanne fled the house and made her way back to her mother's home. When she arrived, she knocked on the door, and when her mother answered, she asked to be let inside to stay the night. Elizabeth, however, turned her own daughter away, saying that her new boyfriend at the time wouldn't allow it. Despite begging to be let in, Elizabeth continued to refuse to help her own daughter. And with nowhere else to go, Suzanne would eventually return to 97 Langworthy Road. A decision that would ultimately prove fatal. By the 7th of December 1992, Suzanne was back living with her stepfather, and it was here that Jean and Bernadette would find her. Now, before I go on to explain what happens next, you need to understand the so-called justification behind the utterly sickening acts which were about to take place. For Jean Powell, it was because Suzanne had allegedly tried to get her to sleep with a man in exchange for money. For Bernadette McNeely, she accused Suzanne of stealing a pink duffel coat. But they all collectively blamed Suzanne after Anthony Dudson, Glyn and Jean Powell, as well as Bernadette, contracted pubic lice. Dudson would later claim in court that he had sexual relations with Suzanne, although this is disputed. He'd also say that he contracted the lice after sleeping in a bed Suzanne used a few nights before. Regardless, instead of looking at their own actions, they collectively agreed that Suzanne had to pay for this. They reached out to her and convinced her to come to 97 Langworthy Road, under the guise that a boy she fancied was there and wanted to speak to her. When she arrived, Suzanne quickly learned this wasn't true. Immediately, Suzanne was pinned down, whereby Glyn proceeded to shave her head and eyebrows clean off. Afterwards, she was forced to clean up and place her hair in a bin. They then placed a plastic bag over her head, and she was forced to walk around while everyone took turns hitting her. Eventually, Suzanne fell to the ground, and while she was curled up, both Jean and Bernadette took turns kicking Suzanne, as well as beating her with 3-foot-long wooden ornaments and whipping her with a belt. The injury sustained here alone caused her to lose function in one arm, which would last throughout her entire ordeal. She was then taken into Jean's bathroom, where she was forced to shave her pubic hair. This was, as they claimed, ritualistic revenge, after both Anthony Dudson and Bernadette McNeely shaved their own hair to rid themselves of their pubic lice. Following this, Jean Powell then locked Suzanne in a small cupboard overnight. The following day, Suzanne was moved to another cupboard in the home, but as her constant screams and cries for help were disturbing the 6 children, she was taken to Bernadette's home and placed in a downstairs back room. Here, she was tied to an upturned bed, spread eagle, using electrical flex. Her mouth was stuffed with socks to muffle her screams. The next 5 days for Suzanne were utter hell. Suzanne was regularly beaten and injected with amphetamines to prevent her from sleeping. She was burned on her face and body with cigarettes and forced to wear headphones, which played at maximum volume. They would play one song, "Hi, I'm Chucky, wanna play?" a rave song by 150 volts. Before her torture would begin, McNeely would start off by saying, "Chucky's coming to play." Suzanne would understandably begin screaming in fear, fully aware as to what was about to happen. A couple of days later, Clifford Pook and Jeffrey Lee would visit, where they'd see Suzanne blindfolded, gagged and tied to the bed. She had been covered in her own urine and feces for several days. Overwhelmed by the smell, they removed her from the bed and placed her in a bath full of concentrated disinfectant. She was scrubbed with a stiff brush so hard that her skin began to peel off. Once she was tied up again, Clifford Pook then took a pair of pliers and would begin to extract her teeth. Anthony Dudson would later say of this experience, quote, "I was stood at the doorway with Jeannie and Bernie. Cliff took her gag off. He told her to open her mouth. He said, 'Right, I'm going to rip your teeth out.' He started hitting her teeth with the pliers. He got the pliers on and started pulling it out, but it just snapped and chipped. Then he hit them a few more times. He put the pliers on again and really, really pulled. He pulled Suzanne's head forward until there was a snap and he had the tooth in the pliers. He did the same again, and he was laughing." One of the most heartbreaking aspects of this story is that there were opportunities for Suzanne to be rescued. A man named David Hill, 18 at the time, was asked to house sit, and while he was there, he heard Anthony Dudson shouting in another room. When he asked what was going on, Jeffrey Lee took him to Suzanne Capper. Hill said he saw Suzanne tied to the base of an upturned bed in a padlocked room. He also said that she had some kind of cloth over her face from just above her eyebrows to just below her nose. She had no hair. At one point, he was left alone with Suzanne. The following is what David Hill would later say. "She asked me if I could help her, but I told her I couldn't. I asked her who she was. She said her name was Suzanne. She asked me if I could untie her. I said I couldn't do anything. I thought they would batter me. If I'd said anything, they'd all have got me, wouldn't they? I didn't know what to do. I was too shocked to do anything. Not only this, but Jeffrey Lee and Anthony Dudson also helped Michelle Capper's fiancé Paul Barlow repair his car during Suzanne's ordeal. Had they said something, anything at the time, things may have been different." Paul himself later said, quote, "They could have told me there and then. The door would have been kicked down and I would have got Suzanne out. I did not think they were capable of such savagery. Now all I want is 10 minutes with them in a back room." The decision was made to move Suzanne out of the home on the 14th of December 1992, after the gang learned that Suzanne's family were to report her missing. They stole a white Fiat Panda and forced her into the boot of the car. Inside the car were Bernadette McNeely, Anthony Dudson, and both Glyn and Jean Powell. They drove about 15 miles to a narrow lane in Werneth Low near Romilly, which is just on the outskirts of Stockport. Reportedly, McNeely was giggling throughout the entire journey. Suzanne was then removed from the boot and forced into the woods, where she would be pushed down an embankment, rolling through leaves and brambles. Thorns would also cut into her feet as she walked. McNeely then poured petrol over the terrified girl and attempted to set her alight. However, McNeely appeared to struggle, although Glyn Powell and Anthony Dodson took over, and within a matter of moments, the petrol ignited and Suzanne was set on fire. While Suzanne screamed in agonising pain, McNeely sang "Burn, Baby Burn," lyrics from the Tramp song Disco Inferno. Eventually the scream stopped and Suzanne was motionless. Believing her to no longer be alive, the four got into the stolen Panda and made their way back to Jean's house, where they would meet up with Clifford Pook and Jeffrey Lee. They bought beer from a newsagent's on their way home, presumably to celebrate a job well done. However, there was one thing the gang didn't bet on. Suzanne was still alive. Incredibly, Suzanne still had some fight left in her, and with all her energy, she managed to stagger her way up the embankment and walk a quarter of a mile despite her injuries. She was found near a golf course by Barry Sutcliffe and two of his colleagues at 6:10 in the morning while on their way to work. They immediately took her and made their way to the nearby home of Michael and Margaret Coop. Barry Sutcliffe would later say, quote, "She said she had been held for over a week in a flat somewhere. She wasn't sure where, and she had been injected with drugs, and that she had been brought up here and dumped." While the Coops would go on to add, "Both her hands appeared like ash. Her legs were just like raw meat, and her feet appeared to be badly charred. I was struck by how polite the victim was. She was constantly thanking my wife for her assistance. I instinctively went to put my arms around her, but she pulled away because she could not bear to be touched. Her head was shaved, and there were recent, not new, cuts to her head. Her face was almost featureless. Her hands were red raw and black at the fingertips. Her legs were red from top to bottom. She couldn't bear anything near her legs." Unable to hold anything due to her injuries, Suzanne drank 6 glasses of water with the help of Margaret. Emergency services would be called, and Suzanne was rushed to Stockport Infirmary, where she would later be transferred to the Specialist Burns Unit at Withington. Police were able to speak with Suzanne, who had sustained burns to over 80% of her body, and she was able to name all the people responsible for her ordeal. At around 7:30 that morning, all 6 were arrested at 97 Langworthy Road. Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely reportedly were laughing and joking with each other as they were arrested. Initially, they all denied any involvement. However, Anthony Dodson was the first to crack after his father convinced him to come clean and tell the truth. Suzanne's condition would gradually worsen, and she would slip into a coma which she would never wake from. On the 18th of December 1992, Suzanne Capper finally succumbed to her injuries. By the end, her mother and stepfather were unable to recognise their daughter, who was only positively identifiable from a partial thumbprint. Jean Powell, Glyn Powell, Bernadette McNeely, Jeffrey Lee, Clifford Pook, and Anthony Dodson were all charged with murder, conspiracy to cause bodily harm, and false imprisonment. Their trial, which began on the 16th of November 1993, lasted 22 days. On the 18th of December 93, the verdicts were in. Bernadette McNeely, Jean, and Glyn Powell were found guilty of all charges and sentenced to 20 years for false imprisonment, 20 years on a conspiracy charge, and handed life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years for the murder of Suzanne Capper. Jeffrey Lee pled guilty to false imprisonment and was sentenced to 12 years behind bars. He was acquitted of the murder and conspiracy charges. Anthony Dodson pled guilty to the false imprisonment charge and was sentenced to 15 years prison. He was also found guilty of the conspiracy charge and sentenced to 15 years, and also for the murder of Suzanne Capper. Due to his age at the time, he was sentenced to indefinite detainment with a minimum tariff of 18 years. Finally, Clifford Pook. He too was acquitted of murder, but pled guilty to both the false imprisonment and conspiracy charges. He was handed 15-year sentences for each crime. All convictions were to be served concurrently. Reportedly, as the sentences were read out, 2 of the jurors wept as cries of "yes, yes" could be heard from the public gallery. A statement was read to the press by Detective Inspector Peter Wall, who led the investigation after the sentences were handed out. In it, he said the following: "Psychological reports say that these are absolutely sane individuals. It's frightening that they are such ordinary people. There is nothing special about any of them." As news of what happened to Suzanne caught the attention of the media, they immediately latched on to the Chucky connection. And it was also unusual in that the 2 ringleaders, Jean Powell and Bernadette McNeely, happened to be women. Additionally, links were made to the James Bulger case after it emerged that John Venables' father, Neil, was an avid horror movie watcher and had rented Child's Play 3 mere weeks before the young toddler was murdered. This, along with Bernadette's actions during Suzanne Capper's ordeal, resulted in Tom Holland, the director of the first Child's Play film, to come out and defend the movie, saying that the viewers of horror movies could only be influenced if they were unbalanced to begin with. David Elstein, who was head of programs at Sky TV at the time, also dismissed the cause and effect link between the 2 crimes and violent films, labelling it, quote, "a false story branded into the consciousness of the media." He also said, "There is no reason to believe that Suzanne Capper would be alive today if the audio tape had instead contained the torture scene from King Lear or a catchphrase from Bruce Forsyth. But the Child's Play hair has been running ever since the last day of the James Bulger murder trial." In April 1994, Professor Elizabeth Newson published Video Violence and the Protection of Children, the Newson Report. She claimed that she had definitively found links between violent films and real-life atrocities, but the report failed to demonstrate this, instead relying heavily on heavily speculative accounts from the media rather than through independent first-hand research. Newson would give an oral presentation to the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee on Video Violence, citing the Suzanne Capper case and its links with Child's Play. However, Sir Ivan Lawrence, former Conservative MP and criminal barrister, whose most notable client was British serial killer Dennis Nielsen, pointed out the inaccuracies in her findings, as well as stating that both the police and the British Board of Film Classification had not found any connection between what happened to Suzanne and the horror film. Regardless, as a result of the media putting attention on Child's Play and both murders, a decision was made to delay the certification for both Natural Born Killers and Reservoir Dogs. Now to a part of the case that frustrates me more than I'd like to admit on video. Jeffrey Lee appealed against his sentence, and on the 4th of November 1994, his false imprisonment charge was reduced from 12 years to just 9. He was released on licence in 1998, which has since expired. Clifford Pook is also a free man, after being released on licence in May of 2001. This too has expired. While Glyn and Jean Powell remain locked up, the same cannot be said for Bernadette McNeely. After initially having her sentence reduced by a year, she was released from prison in 2015, apparently being labelled as a model prisoner throughout her time inside. This was despite the fact that after a routine check of her cell back when she was in HM Prison Durham in 1996, letters were uncovered which exposed an affair between a married prison governor named Mike Martin and McNeely. However, before any disciplinary action could be taken, Mike Martin handed in his resignation. She was also said to be in a romantic relationship with Moore's murderer Myra Hindley before being transferred to HM Prison Newhall immediately after her affair was exposed, where she would go on to share a wing with Rose West. After her release, she would go on to live in the same housing block as Karen Matthews. If you're not aware who she is, Karen was the subject of one of my earlier videos. Needless to say, she's dubbed Britain's worst mum for a reason. Then there's Anthony Dudson. He too appealed his sentence, and in 2002, this was reduced from 18 years minimum to just 16. He would appeal again, saying that the reduction was insufficient, but this was dismissed on the 21st of November 2003. However, he was later moved to an open prison in 2009. While digging further, I found out something that, to my knowledge, I've not seen anyone else mention. While most sources list him as still being in prison, in 2013, a parole board granted his release from prison after stating he, and I quote, posed no risk to the public. While I couldn't find anything to suggest this was overturned or upheld, it does mean that potentially he too is a free man. Personally, the mere fact any of them are out walking the streets is an example of the justice system failing the victims and their families. It's the 29th of September 1978. 15-year-old Mary Vincent finds herself on the side of a road in Berkeley, California, with 2 other people, as she's currently hitchhiking 400 plus miles to Corona, California, to live with her grandfather. Sticking her thumb up at the side of the road, a blue van would pull up alongside Mary. Inside the van would sit a middle-aged, balding man in the driver's seat. The driver would tell Mary that he only had room for her and not the other 2. Mary would speak with the others, who would warn her not to go with the man, sensing something wasn't quite right. He seemed to have plenty of room, but was adamant he would only take Mary. Mary would decide to take the ride, ignoring the advice from the other 2 hitchhikers. It would be a decision that she would regret for the rest of her life. To understand why Mary was hitchhiking in the first place, we need to first take a look at her background in more detail. Born in 1963, Mary was one of 7 children to parents Herb and Lucy. Mary would grow up in Las Vegas with her father working as a gambling machine repairman and her mother working as a casino dealer. Her parents raised their children in a strict environment, but as Mary entered her teenage years, she would test their patience repeatedly, bunking off school and wearing makeup. Despite Mary's rebellious nature, she was focused on her ambitions to become a dancer. Specifically, she dreamed of one day becoming a lead performer at the Lido di Paris Cabaret in Las Vegas. By 1978, things were stressful for Mary and her family. Herb and Lucy's marriage would break down, resulting in the couple beginning divorce proceedings. Mary would grow to become frustrated in her surroundings and made the decision to run away from home with her boyfriend at the time. After leaving home in the summer of 1978, Mary and her boyfriend would spend time in Sausalito, California, with the pair living out of the boyfriend's car. However, this was relatively short-lived after police arrested Mary's boyfriend on suspicion of raping a high school teenager. After her boyfriend's arrest, Mary would initially sleep rough or in unlocked cars before traveling to SoCal, California to live with her uncle. However, this would be short-lived as Mary would eventually decide to travel over 400 miles to live with her grandfather in Corona, California. It's here that we arrive at the point where Mary hitched a lift with the man in the blue van. The man told Mary that he was traveling to Reno, Nevada. However, he would be prepared to take her as far as Los Angeles. Initially, Mary felt relatively relaxed with the driver. She sparked up a cigarette and began smoking. But soon into the journey, she sneezed, prompting the driver to ask her if she was sick. He reached his hand around to the back of her neck, saying that he was just checking her temperature. Mary quickly assured him that she was well, jerking away in the process and resting her head against the passenger door. He released his grip off of her and popped his hand back onto the steering wheel. While the man's touching was certainly unwelcome, Mary eventually brushed this off as the man just simply being concerned. Reportedly, the man said that he needed to stop by his home in San Francisco to pick up some laundry. Mary was trusting enough of the man at this point to agree to the pit stop, even helping him put the items into his van in the process. Back on the road, the man was now drinking from a milk carton that actually contained liquor inside. By now, Mary felt safe enough that she would fall asleep. When Mary woke up, she immediately recognized something wasn't right, as she noticed that the man was traveling in the wrong direction. When Mary saw that the road signs showed they were heading straight towards Nevada, alarm bells began to ring. Mary, in a moment of anger, looked around and found a long, sharp stick. Picking it up, she pointed it at the man and demanded that he turn the vehicle round or let her out of the van. Surprisingly, the man assured Mary that he had simply made an honest mistake and took a wrong turn. He turned the vehicle around, assuring Mary that she was not in any danger. As sunset approached, the man told Mary that he would need to pull over to relieve himself. He turned off of the freeway and headed down a deserted road along a canyon. Again, Mary began to feel on edge and noticed that her shoes were untied. Not wanting to raise suspicion, Mary decided to wait until the man had pulled over, whereby she could get out of the vehicle and tie her shoes, just in case she needed to make an escape. The man pulled over, got out of the vehicle, and headed towards the back of the van. Mary followed suit and got out of the van to tie her shoelaces. But as she was doing this, she felt a sudden pain on her back. She had been struck with a hammer. Another blow with the tool to the back of Mary's head would render her unconscious. When Mary came to, she found herself in the back of the man's van with her hands tied behind her back. The man then climbed into the back of the van with Mary. "Don't scream, or I'll kill you," he told a petrified Mary. He then ripped off her clothes and forced himself on her. After finishing the assault, he then climbed into the driver's seat of the van and drove a few miles before stopping at Del Puerto Canyon. Mary would beg her captor to free her from her unimaginable ordeal, but the man produced a plastic jug filled with an unknown liquid. Freeing Mary's hands from the ropes, he told Mary that if she wanted to live, she would need to obey his every command. He ordered Mary to drink the liquid, but Mary was rightfully hesitant. "Drink it, or I'll kill you," he told a frightened Mary, who realised she had no choice and consumed the drink. The man would then force himself on Mary again, this time carrying out unspeakable acts in the process. The ordeal would last several hours, with Mary eventually passing out again due to a combination of alcohol and fear. By the time she came to again, she continued to beg the man to set her free. The man ordered Mary out of the van and told her to lie on the edge of the road. She did as she was told, but could hear the man rummaging around in the van. She then felt the man's hand grab her left hand. "You want to be free? I'll set you free," the man said to Mary as he swung an axe into her left forearm. After cutting off her left forearm with 3 strong swings, he moved to the right arm and proceeded to hack away, severing her right forearm too. Reportedly, Mary's left hand was still tightly gripped to the man's sleeve after being cut off, causing him to flail his arm to release its hold of him. Mary's shrieks of unbelievable pain quickly changed to silence. Mary, now motionless, was dragged by the man to an embankment and was pushed down a 30-foot drop. He then stuffed her limp body into a concrete pipe. Leaving Mary there, the man coldly said to her, "Okay, now you're free." The man returned to his van and drove away, convinced he had successfully ended the life of Mary Vincent. However, he was wrong. Mary was still alive. After having her arms removed, Mary's survival instincts had kicked into gear. She remained motionless while being dragged towards the embankment, and after being thrown down it and stuffed into the concrete pipe, she continued to play dead, despite the immense pain and suffering she was experiencing at the time. She waited inside the concrete pipe for several hours in a crumpled position, in fear that the man may be waiting. But by the time the sun was climbing over the horizon, she knew she needed to find help. By now, Mary was extremely weak due to the pain and blood loss, and she knew if she gave in to the urge to rest her eyes, she would never open them again. Mary would use mud and dirt to stuff the nubs to cauterize the wounds and reduce the amount of blood she was losing. She would then leave the concrete pipe, relieved to find that the man had long since gone. She would then climb back up the same 30-foot embankment she had been thrown from successfully. After reaching the top, she lifted her arms above her head to prevent the muscles in her arms falling out, and she would begin a 3-mile trek out of the culvert, following the sounds of traffic towards a nearby freeway on Interstate 5. Miraculously, she made it to roadside, and not long after reaching the road, a car approached. But the people inside the car, upon seeing Mary, continued to drive, likely in fear of what they were witnessing. Understandably, this was demoralizing for Mary, but shortly after, a couple who were on vacation were driving down the same road. When they witnessed a naked, mutilated Mary, they immediately stopped, placed her into the car, and used linens they had to wrap her up. They would then drive her to a nearby airport and call for an ambulance. Now in hospital, Mary would undergo extensive surgery, which thankfully was successful. She would be fitted with prosthetic arms while recovering. Police would also visit to speak with Mary, who provided them with a detailed account of what happened. She would also assist with providing police sketch artists a description of the man responsible for her ordeal. The image would be released to the public, whereby a man would contact police to say that the man was a neighbour of his. The man, he said, was Lawrence Singleton. Lawrence was a 51-year-old man who had recently split from his wife, whom he shared a teenage daughter with. He was a merchant seaman, but at the time of the attack he was unemployed. Police would arrest Singleton, but he would deny any wrongdoing. In March 1979, Singleton would be in court for the kidnap, attempted murder and sexual assault of Mary Vincent. Mary would attend the trial to bravely give evidence against Singleton. When Singleton took to the stand, he told the court that it was actually he who was the victim. He said that Mary was nothing more than a quote $10 a night whore, who told him that unless he took her to California, she would falsely accuse him of sexually assaulting her. He also told the court that there were 2 other hitchhikers in the van that day, and it was they who mutilated Mary. But when Mary gave her testimony, Singleton's story quickly fell apart. She explained in painful detail the events that took place, referring to Singleton only as my attacker. When she finished, she walked past Singleton, who whispered something to her that caused Mary to quickly leave the courtroom. She later explained to prosecutors that he had said, "I'll finish this job if it takes me the rest of my life." Lawrence Singleton would be found guilty of all charges, but shockingly he was only sentenced to 14 years behind bars. The judge residing the case openly told Singleton if they could, they would lock him up for the rest of his life, but was unable to, as the sentence given to him was the maximum one the judge could hand down. Life after the attack was not easy for Mary. She suffered with severe depression and had to undergo years of physical and mental therapy in order to adjust to her new life with her prosthetic arms. Mary would also be transferred to a new school that was better suited to cater to her needs. Mary would later say that the therapy was unsuccessful and that her old friends distanced themselves from her, with Mary believing that they were either uncomfortable with her prosthetics or that they had grown to hate her. Even more difficult for Mary was soon after her parents' divorce, the family drifted apart. A civil lawsuit was filed following the attack, which Mary won. She would be awarded $2.56 million, but sadly would receive nothing, as Singleton was unemployed at the time of the attack and reportedly only had $200 to his name at the time of his arrest. The ghost of Lawrence Singleton never really left Mary after his conviction. The trauma of the attack, coupled with the threats he made to her at the criminal trial, left her understandably weary of others. Despite this, she would marry in 1987, but this relationship broke down within 3 years. She would, however, give birth to 2 sons during this time. It was also in 1987 that Mary would learn that her worst fear had been realised. Lawrence Singleton, having just served 8 years of his 14-year sentence, had been released on parole. Now with 2 sons and her family spread out from each other, Mary was constantly living in fear that Singleton may track her down and keep to his word. News of Lawrence Singleton's parole sparked protests across California, with many understandably furious that he only had served just over half of his sentence. The justification for his early release, the state said, was for good behavior. Initially, he was paroled to Contra Costa County, California, but found that no town would be willing to accept him into their community. Each time there was an attempt to place him at a location, large numbers of protesters would gather, forcing authorities to remove him, sometimes requiring armed guards and shielding him in a bulletproof vest in the process. As a result, he spent the rest of his one-year parole in a trailer on the grounds of San Quentin prison, only leaving to collect groceries or to visit the cinema. Singleton, however, still believed he had done nothing wrong, and amazingly convinced himself that it was he who was the victim of Mary Vincent. He lodged a civil complaint, maintaining that Vincent and 2 other hitchhikers had extorted money from him in order to buy drugs. He continued to insist that it was these 2 other hitchhikers who had abused and maimed Mary, but these claims were dismissed outright. After finishing his parole, Singleton would move back to Florida. However, he would find himself in trouble. In 1990, he served a 60-day sentence after he stole a disposable camera worth $10. Later that same year, he would land himself in prison on a 2-year stint after stealing a hat worth $3. After his release, Singleton would seemingly go under the radar until he reappeared again in 1997 after a police officer knocked on his door on the 19th of February 1997. At approximately 6 p.m, Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office received a 911 call from a house painter who had peered into the window of Singleton's home and found him naked and plunging a knife repeatedly into a woman while she lay sprawled on a couch. Deputy Raphael Morphy was dispatched to Singleton's home, but it reportedly took officers 34 minutes to arrive on scene, despite the caller apparently saying to the operator, quote, "The same guy that cut that girl's arms off is beating another woman." The delays were ultimately blamed on a combination of rush hour traffic and lack of deputies due to it being shift change time. When he eventually knocked on the door, Singleton answered. His shirt was covered in blood. Singleton had tried to explain this away by saying he simply cut himself shaving, but when Morphy looked behind Singleton, he could see that on the floor lay the body of a lifeless woman. Morphy arrested Singleton there and then, but was unable to search the home at that point in time, as Singleton refused to allow him into his home. After a 2-hour wait for a search warrant, one was granted, allowing officers to go inside and investigate. The woman was identified as being 31-year-old mother of 3, Roxanne Hayes. Roxanne was known to police, as she had been arrested by them on as many as 99 occasions, mostly on prostitution charges. People who knew Roxanne told reporters that she had struggled with drugs and she used sex work to support her family. She had been stabbed multiple times and left on the floor in a pool of her own blood. Singleton was taken into custody and even openly told reporters within hours of his arrest, quote, "I did it." At his trial, Mary Vincent was asked to give testimony, and she accepted, wanting to ensure that Singleton didn't get another chance of another early release. She again bravely stood in the same courtroom with the man who caused her such misery just 2 decades earlier and told a jury of her harrowing experience. Singleton again attempted to play victim, telling jurors that he picked up Hayes on a Tampa street. He said that she agreed to have sex with him for $20, but he alleged that she tried to take more from him, leading to him, and I shit you not, accidentally stabbing her 7 times while trying to stop her. Obviously, the court sided against Singleton, as it took them just 4 hours on the 15th of April 1998 to sentence him to death by electric chair. The judge residing over the case told an emotionless Lawrence Singleton, quote, "This was an unprovoked, senseless killing of a human being. We are living in times worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. Mary Vincent appeared at a press conference following the sentencing, telling reporters the following: "I didn't want to play God and don't want anyone's death on my hands, but I think there's a little bit of relief. I think I can start all over and put everything behind me and hopefully be safe and happy." As for Lawrence Singleton, the man dubbed the Mad Chopper died on the 28th of December 2001. It wouldn't be the chair that ended his life, but cancer. Following Singleton's death sentence, the resulting anger over his initial sentencing caused legislators to seek longer sentences for violent criminals. A bill dubbed Singleton's Law was introduced that sought to achieve this aim. The bill was strongly supported by Mary Vincent. Her life would begin to take a more positive turn in the 90s, when she married again in 1998, and would continue to work on her art, using her talent to inspire others. While Mary lives a mostly private life, she is a staunch advocate for victims' rights, and occasionally delivers motivational speeches to people who've experienced traumatic situations. Despite everything Mary Vincent has experienced, she now no longer considers herself a victim. Before you go, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an upload. There's also the option to join up as a channel member. While there's no obligation, it really does help out the channel, as well as bringing me one step closer to achieving my goal, which is to make what I do here a full-time gig. Speaking of which, here's a shout out to those already helping me out: Neil and Fur, The Alabastard, Mr. Gently Benevolent, Amanda, Krista Lands, Omniblast, Shamu Dog Smith, Angie Thompson, and Holy Holy. Thank you for supporting the channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye. For now.